Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics. I feel like they just used ChatGPT for that one. After years of waiting, Capcom has finally answered our prayers with the beloved Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection. Folks, I never thought we'd be here. I never in a million years thought we'd ever see a compilation of any of these titles, much less almost all of them. To be a fighting game fan right now in this timeline, chef's kiss. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But enough about that. You wanna know my thoughts. You wanna know if I think this collection is worth getting. Well, if you like Marvel vs. Capcom fighting games, you've already gotten the collection. So, okay, congratulations, you're done. No more video for you. And if you have no desire to do any of this, or this, and the Marvel IP or intellectual property means absolutely nothing to you, then you've already decided you're not gonna play the game and pick up the title, even on a discount. But for everyone else, this one is for you. This review is for you. Because this is a pretty monumental release, and you might not know it. You see, back in the early 90s, Capcom established a partnership of sorts with Marvel Studios. Or at least in this case, it was just Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics was not the big behemoth that it is today. You know, didn't rake in that Robert Downey Avengers money, if you know what I'm talking about. Now, this was during a time when Marvel Comics was kind of treading on thin ice financially. And Capcom struck a deal. And I mean a deal. It was incredibly cheap for them to do this, to use the intellectual property of Marvel-style characters in games that Capcom was being really financially successful with, such as beat-em-ups and fighting games and action games of sorts, which spawned with it a wonderful series of fighting games that we're talking about today. And this release, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge one, let me tell you. I mean, up until this point, the only way to play these games legitimately of any kind was to play their oftentimes watered down, not very good console ports from yesteryear, or to own the actual arcade boards. Like this one, or this one. And these things die, by the way. They have these things called suicide batteries in them that if you don't get them replaced or hacked, like I have done, they just die. And you're done with a dummy piece of plastic that is no good. They're big, they're honking. And even if you replace the suicide battery in here, that's right, they actually called them suicide batteries, crazy. If you replace the suicide battery, or at the very least hack it so it doesn't need one anymore, even the parts inside of these boards aren't meant to last forever. At some point, they are going to completely fail. So not only is this bulky and incredibly expensive and not intuitive at all to use on a modern television, much less an arcade machine, but these were the only ways you could play these games in their arcade perfect fashion legitimately. Until today. For the first time ever, these games are now in one robust package for you as a consumer to pick up and play, and you're getting more or less the best versions of these games in that package. You've got the Punisher arcade beat 'em up. You've got the original game that started all, X-Men Children of the Atom. You've got Marvel Superheroes. You've got X-Men versus Street Fighter, a monumental title in this series. Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. Marvel vs. Capcom 1, Clash of Superheroes. And of course, probably the reason you're all interested in picking up this collection, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes. All of those games in one package for $49.99 US. And yes, I'm aware the price just keeps increasing on these collections, but I think in this case, it's absolutely warranted. You have access to, basically, caveats included, arcade perfect versions of these ports, incredible training modes included for every single release except for the Punisher beat 'em up, access to rollback online netcode, which is phenomenal, and a lovely library of artwork as well as music from these games. Some of these pieces of artwork I have never seen before as an arcade enthusiast and just overall Marvel fan. This is such a treat of a collection that on those merits alone, you should go pick up this game, whether it's on sale or not. But we're not done yet. We have to talk about these games in their totality to really understand the gravitas of this collection. First off, 1993's The Punisher, made by Capcom on an upgraded version of their Capcom Play System hardware. This is a beat 'em up that's really, really, really good. And up until recent years, when indie developers have been making some of the greatest beat 'em ups of all time, I would have said that this Punisher arcade game stood up amongst the best. It still does, but not quite as high on that totem pole as it used to. That's because the technology behind this game allowed this game to have almost unfettered amount of enemies on screen all at once, on top of really robust game mechanics, on top of just really fun gameplay, an incredible soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura. Just an incredible game. And this game only got one consumer release on the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis back in the day. While I have quite a large fondness for that particular release, it was far from arcade perfect. This is the best way now to play this game, and now consumers have access to it. I'm not gonna lie, for certain beat 'em up fans, $50 to have access to this particular game might be worth it for them. I'm not joking, that's how great of a game this is. So you get a really wonderful bonus of a fantastic beat 'em up here, and its historical significance is not lost on me. Hopefully it's not lost on you as well. Then starting things off is X-Men Children of the Atom. This game started off the Marvel craze here by giving us things like air combos, automatic mode, fly in, fly out, X powers, the ability to use super moves by just doing one motion input and then pressing 2 buttons as opposed to the other way around. This game was developed by a massive team at Capcom and led by, you guessed it, Akira Nishitani himself. That's right, the main planner and director behind Street Fighter 2. So let's see, this guy, he made Street Fighter 2 and he made Marvel. He's like the king of fighting game developers. This game was incredible. To try to explain how amazing this game was at the time, when this game was released, I distinctly remember walking into my local skating rink that had a bevy of new arcade games, and one of them was this particular game. It had a huge decal on it saying X-Men Children of the Atom, and here were these big, beautiful, wonderful characters on screen. And I looked at the control panel, and it was 6 buttons on each side, which told me this was going to be a fighting game just like Street Fighter. I put my quarter in, and of course I picked the only character that mattered at the time to my kid brain, Wolverine. You'd pick Wolverine too. Picking Wolverine, and his animations were incredible and fluid like nothing I'd ever seen before. But most importantly, I remember hitting one particular button on my arcade machine, the Fierce Punch button, or the Hard Punch button as we might know it today. Hitting Fierce, and I saw Wolverine do this wonderful X slash with so many frames of animation, and it looked so powerful and immense. And it was just a button press. Just a normal move is what Wolverine has. This wasn't like the Konami beat 'em up where using special moves cost life or meter. No, you could just do these things on the fly, and it was free. And of course, Wolverine had amazing moves at his disposal, just like every other character in this cast did.
Oh yeah, those are cute.
What do you think, buddy? Berserker Barrage? Berserker Barrage?
Meow for daddy. Meow.
And it really was just the next level of 2D fighting games. If you were someone in the United States like I was, I mean, you just couldn't wait to keep playing this game and seeing what else Capcom would come up with. And they would come up with something pretty unique. Marvel superheroes would come out shortly thereafter. And my gosh, I can't describe to you how incredible that game was when it came out. In one fighting game, you had Spider-Man, you had Captain America, you had Iron Man, and you had Wolverine. Those were like the biggest heavy hitters that Marvel Comics had at the time. So to play one single fighting game that had all those characters in it, it was truly amazing. Fun fact, for a long period of time, Marvel Superheroes used to be my favorite fighting game ever made. Not so much anymore, but it held that top spot for quite a long time. And then, in a move that surprised literally every single person that went to arcades, we saw the next Marvel fighting game. But it wasn't, a sequel to X-Men Children of the Atom, and it wasn't a sequel to Marvel Superheroes. Or rather it was, but in its own way. It was X-Men versus Street Fighter. Folks, I cannot describe to you the feeling we all had when we saw this game for the first time. This was our version of Super Smash Bros. Street Fighter characters plus X-Men characters. And the one question we all had is, how are Street Fighter characters going to be able to hang with X-Men characters? They found a way to make them hang. In fact, X-Men vs. Street Fighter is the first game that would give characters like Ryu and Ken a universal dash, a universal super jump option. Being able to see these characters do super moves in the air was just, it was incredible. It was amazing. You had to be there. And then of course this was shortly followed up by Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, a title that in its day was incredibly popular and I loved it to pieces. In retrospect has been seen as the lesser of the two games. Easy to see why. Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter doesn't have any original characters in its cast prior to the 3 previous releases, and it's more or less seen as just kind of a quick patch job from X-Men vs. Street Fighter onwards. But I gotta be honest, some of the additional polish and wonderful things about this game really make it worthwhile. For instance, the announcer literally announces the super moves as you're doing them, and you had additional win quotes that these characters had to really kind of give it a little bit of additional spark. Plus, if you love Shotokan characters, well, they're all there. All the Shotos are in this game, basically. It was a wonderful time to be a gaming fan, but no one thought it could get better than this. And little did we know that it would. Shortly thereafter, we would see in arcades, quietly kind of planted in there, we didn't see this coming at all, an update to Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. In fact, I'll be honest, the first time I put a quarter into this machine, I thought I was playing just the same game. But after a couple seconds, I realized this is a completely different game. Marvel vs. Capcom. This was Capcom saying that, hey, you know who Marvel is, and now you know who Capcom is. I mean, you had Strider, you had Captain Commando, you had Mega Man joining the likes of Ryu and Chun-Li and Gambit and Wolverine, and oh my gosh, I mean, this game has one of the greatest rosters ever. I know it's incredibly small and not very by modern standards, but my gosh, my friends and I spent so much time and money on these machines. I distinctly remember trying to find excuses to go to my local movie theater, which had this machine, and we would go about an hour early, dunk a bunch of quarters in there, and just play the game until the movie started, usually through some of the opening credits and previews. And then when the movie was over, go back to that arcade where that machine was and keep dunking as many quarters as we could until we had to go home or if our parents had to pick us up. I mean, this was a big deal, and it became one of my favorite video games ever to play. My friends and I just spent so much time on this. What an amazing game. Just truly incredible. And then, well, you all know what came next, right? Marvel vs. Capcom 2 with its incredibly massive roster, cutting edge technology, allowing you to cram almost every character that had come before, add a couple new ones on top, allow you to go 3-on-3 head to head. Oh my gosh. Would it surprise you to know that for a while, some of us didn't like that game very much? I'm not gonna point fingers at anyone else, but I know for a fact, I was around during that time. For about 6 months to a year, quite a few of us kind of stood our noses to that particular video game. 3D in the background, but 2D up front, and it kind of gave this Vaseline look to everything that was kind of bizarre. The crispness and the colorfulness of the pixel art from the originals had just been lost. But we live in the year 2024, and I'm here to tell you that anyone that says that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is a bad game, it's just, I mean, all opinions are valid, but you're kind of wrong. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is one of the greatest video games ever made, not just because of what it brings to the table, but its monumental history in the esports space. Many would say that MVC2 is directly responsible for giving us one of the greatest gaming prodigies of our time, who would later go on and win many Street Fighter tournaments in the near future. In fact, MVC2 is probably the game that got a lot of naysayers in the competitive circuit to say, oh, there is some competitive valor and merit to playing these Marvel versus titles. Because prior to this, it was very common to kind of poo-poo on these games, say these are just for casuals. These are for people that don't know honest footsies or neutral. I'm laughing because it's absurd, but that was true. That was what people said at the time. Now there's an entire subgenre of these type of games. Some people call them hyper fighters, but it kind of came from the Marvel vs. series. To have all of these games in one collection and lovingly preserved is just truly phenomenal. By the way, the online functionality is really good. Right now, there's no crossplay, and right now there are some matchmaking issues between versions of the game, whether you're playing the Japanese or the American version. They have since released they're gonna be fixing that in the near future. There's some nitpicks here. For instance, there's a devout X-Men Children of the Atom community. They play a specific version of this game, and this version that's included in the collection isn't it. On top of that, there's a devout X-Men versus Street Fighter community. This version included in the collection is also not the version they typically like to play. And on top of that, there's been numerous changes to all the games across the board, most notably Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and some people have some feelings about some of those changes, especially for a game that's been around for 20, 25 years or so. Which gets us to some of the negative things about this collection. There are some omissions, some flaws, some things that one could look at and go, Couldn't they have just gone a little bit further to make sure that everyone could get their fill? For instance, couldn't they have included all the versions, all the different revisions of all these particular games just for historical purposes? Couldn't they have included some of the features from the digital Eclipse version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 that people liked, like the artificial widescreen look, as well as the sharpening of the background textures? Couldn't they have made the online just a little bit more robust so replays were available and spectators was easier to do? Yes, they could have done all of those things. I'm not gonna lie to you. But what's here is truly incredible. And on top of that, the emulation quality for almost all of these titles I can speak for on firsthand is truly immaculate. While I don't have as much experience with the arcade version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, of which that version is here in this collection, I have played and I own all of the other prior Marvel vs. fighting games on its original hardware, and I can speak after my play with the titles. They feel great. The input latency is next to zero, especially on PC. It really does feel like a one-to-one true arcade-like experience, which back in the 90s and early 2000s, we were always after that moniker of arcade perfect. And I can easily say that on this collection, we can say that these titles are arcade perfect. There are some nitpicks, there are some problems with this collection, but I have to be honest, I'm at a place where if I were to really push the needle on some of these issues and really get upset at Capcom for some of these decisions they've had to make with the collection, I'd sound incredibly ungrateful. Because there's no universe why these games should be able to be in one collection for a small price that you can pay for, and you can have them right now at your disposal. So I feel really ungrateful to kind of point out some of those things, but those things do exist, so just be mindful of that. Now, if you're looking at this collection and it seems really nice to you, but you're just not that kind of gamer, well, let me just kind of reiterate something to you. These games, a vast majority of them, were directed by Atsushi Tomita, a name you might not be familiar with, but Atsushi Tomita had a mission in mind. He started development on the original X-Men, Children of the Atom, then became director, starting with X-Men vs. Street Fighter. His mission was to make games that were predominantly fun. He didn't care so much about game balance. In fact, you can see that quite plainly whenever you pull up any kind of YouTube search feed on any of these types of games. He didn't care about that. He thought that Capcom headquarters in Japan at the time was focusing too much predominantly on balance, and that was getting in the way of the fun. In fact, you can see some of his messages in his X.com or tweet profile here, talking about Marvel superheroes versus Street Fighter, and how he's still a little upset about how that particular project went down, having to make changes to Ken so he would stand out more amidst Ryu's playstyle for what he thought were meaningless reasons. He really wanted games to be all about fun first, and then the complexity would just come throughout that factor. You'll see this in Marvel vs. Capcom 1 especially, where he made the damage a little bit higher than prior titles, made the game much more ground-based, and you can get very far in that game not knowing too much of what you're doing. That's the beauty about these games. There's different tiers of how you can enjoy this. You can enjoy it on just the most basic of fun tier of just mashing buttons and having a good time. You can learn some of the more nuanced system mechanics and get a lot further, and then learn maybe some of the more favorable characters in these rosters. And then of course there's the third tier of just like optimizing every single thing about your gameplay to the point where your opponent can't have an opportunity to breathe. The fact that these games offer all of that is truly incredible and is fun at every single one of those levels. I cannot recommend this collection enough. Even if you've only had a tertiary understanding or appreciation for the series, I highly implore you to pick it up. And no, I don't want you to pick it up so that way we'll incentivize Capcom to make Marvel vs. Capcom 4. No. I mean, that would be nice, but truthfully, this collection is truly wonderful. I want you to pick it up so you can have it. I want you to pick it up so you can enjoy something that I've been enjoying for over 20 years. I want you to pick it up so you can learn the joy of just seeing what buttons do what, explodey sparks everywhere, and your character coming out on top and you clicking rematch and wanting to go one more time. That's what these games spark for a lot of people, and myself included. So, without further ado, this particular collection, Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics, gets my Scare quality seal of approval. Now, all that's left is to ask you the most important question of all, which is, where your curly mustache at?